All right, welcome to AP History LEQ, the 2023 edition. All right, let's dive right in. So the LEQ is 15% of the exam. So it's the smallest portion of the exam as far as weighting goes. It is 40 minutes, but sort of, right? You get 100 minutes for the DBQ and the LEQ combined. And the DBQ is worth more. So if you go over the allotted 60 minutes for the DBQ, that's fine. But then you have to kind of make that time up in your LEQ. It is out of 6 points, but you have the choice of 3 questions. So they're going to give you 3, but you only write 1. You do not need to write more than that. And they're each in different time frames. So you're going to pick the one, obviously, that you know the most, right? The one that's from the time. The other part with these questions is they all deal with the same historical thinking skill or historical reasoning process, right? So one of the key things you need to do is identify that historical reasoning process right off the bat. So it's either causation, comparison, or continuity and change over time. And sometimes they're hard to identify. Sometimes there's flexibility, but not usually in the LEQ. Usually it's pretty clear, and all 3 questions deal with the same one. So if you can't figure it out for the question you're most comfortable with in the time frame, look at the other questions to identify that. When you're doing that, also make sure you use the actual words in your essay, like this compares with, this is a continuity, or whatever. We'll get to that more in a minute. So step 1, you're going to read the prompt. Step 2, identify which time frame you're going to go for. Step 3, identify the historical reasoning process, and then you're going to write the essay. A couple of other just little tidbits, like as you know, don't use first person, right? And generally, you don't need to do that. And then only include relevant information, right? You do want to have lots of information in there, but only stuff that is relevant to the prompt. Don't talk about the Americas or Oceania if the prompt is about Afro-Eurasia, okay? Now, in this next part, let's review the thesis, right? Because it is the most important part of your essay. You know, you're going to write your contextualization. You're going to come back and do your thesis. And there's one minor thing that's different with the LEQ. So when you're writing your thesis, although Y, X because A and B, right, and you're having 2 specific points, you want to make your A the strongest argument, right? You want to make sure that it is really strong. And the reason being is when you get to the essay, right, and the reader is looking over it, if you're starting out strong, your first body paragraph is crushing it, then they're going to think like, oh, this person knows their business. And they may tend to give you the benefit of the doubt later on when maybe your argument's not quite as clear or not quite as consistent. And so really make sure your X because of A is the strongest argument and the one that you know the most about. All right, when we're looking at the LEQ, this is the new formula or format that you're going to be working with for 2023. It's a 3-paragraph, simple essay. So theoretically, you could even get it done in like 30 minutes, right? If you want to screenshot this or if you want to contact me for this formula in the notes, please do so. So here's how it works, right? Your introduction, you have paragraph 1 is going to contain your contextualization. It's going to be 2 to 3 sentences long, right? Then immediately following that, you're having your thesis. And it says 1 to 2 sentences, but 1 sentence, right? Although Y, X because A and B. Make it a nice juicy sentence, right? Make sure that your X because of A is really your solid one. But 1 sentence there for your thesis statement. Then you're going to start your first body paragraph. And so these steps are a little bit tricky, so follow along with me here. You're going to do your X because of A, right? And you're going to pick your strongest. Readers are human. Make them think you're smart, right? That's your topic sentence, though. Simply X because of A. Then you're going to provide 2 specific examples that support your argument, making sure you tie it back to your thesis. Right? And this is really important, right? So being able to say like, hey, this is my argument, right? Here's an example of it, and here's how that example supports my argument. You do that twice, all right? Hear me out. So that is going to be your first body paragraph. Now, making sure that you provide analysis, right? And you're going to prompt your sentence in that. A cause of this, or this compares to, and then you're going to tie it back to your thesis, right? So you have your evidence, you're going to provide analysis, right? Saying this is causing this to happen. If you are answering the prompt properly, like if your thesis statement actually answers the prompt and you're interweaving it into your argument, then the analysis portion should be easy, right? It shouldn't necessarily have something you think about because you're answering the prompt, you're answering the question. Providing an argument or counter argument, so not just an opposite example, and this is kind of important. Your counter argument can be your although why, right? But what you're going to do is you're going to say, hey, this is my argument. Here's 2 pieces of evidence. Now here is another counter argument. An example, like some would say X wasn't a result of A because of blank, or some would say that this was a stronger argument because of blank. But then lastly, and this is important, you reinforce your argument. But the aforementioned evidence shows that really X because of A, right? And so you'll provide a counter argument, and then you'll have your reinforcement of your actual X because of A. What this going to do is show that you have a complex understanding, right? And you'll have two pieces of evidence. You'll also have a counter argument. Note that this can be your although Y. Now here's where it gets a little bit trickier. In body paragraph 2, it's going to be X because of B, right? And it's the same as above, right? You're going to X because of B. You're going to provide two pieces of evidence. Then you're going to provide another counter argument. But this one is going to be although Z, right? And this one's not included in your thesis. It's just, it doesn't have to be from there. It's just a separate thing. Like, well, what would somebody say to counter argument U, right? And your X because of B. And whatever they would say to that, you would put that in there. But then again, right, reinforce your original argument. Evidence shows actually X because of B, right? And then lastly, not necessarily a closing paragraph, but only if you have time, you have a closing sentence or two where you rewrite your thesis statement in a slightly different way. One of the points you can get when it describes a thesis statement point can be in the very first paragraph or in your last paragraph. And so if you rewrite it, maybe you didn't do it quite right the first time, or maybe you've kind of reframed your arguments as you've gone through the essay. You can rewrite it there. Okay, now let's look at some examples here, or let's look at the CED. All right, here we have LEQ evidence from 2023. As you can see here, provides specific examples of at least two pieces of evidence relevant to the topic of the prompt. You get 1 point. Supports an argument in response to the prompt using at least two pieces of specific and relevant evidence. You get 2 points. All right. So when we say examples, right, plural needs to be at least two. Supports an argument. You need to explain how or why it's relevant. It needs to be specific. All right. It needs to be very clear. Use proper nouns. Use very clear, specific examples. It must be different from contextualization. All right, you shouldn't be repeating things that you talked about in your contextualization, even if that temptation is there. And then also make sure you use the language from the historical thinking skills, right? It doesn't dumb it down, right? Don't feel like you need to allude to it. Be very clear for the reader. And then don't go outside of your thesis. Like, make sure you stick to your thesis point. All right, let's take a look at some examples. All right, at this time, I want you to take a second. I want you to pause the video, and I want you to watch or read through the prompt, read through the thesis, and then look at the examples and tell me if they get the evidence and support point. Figure it out. There's 5 examples here. Figure it out first. I do want to also point out that this is not a great thesis statement. It's a pretty mediocre thesis statement because they were used to it and they thought they did not have enough say in British Parliament. Right? Not a super strong thesis statement, but see if these evidence would get the point. All right, pause it now. Okay, let's look at this. Example number 1. The British Parliament began to tax goods without knowledge, consent of the colonists. Political figures begin to write documents and pamphlets, such as Thomas Paine's Common Sense. Does this evidence help answer the question, evaluate the extent to which ideas of self-government influenced American colonial reaction to British imperial authority in the period 1754-1776? Now, this is a question that we're going to be getting to later on in the year as far as when this is relevant for us. But if we look at this first one, do we have specific evidence in it? Yeah, they do get a point for evidence. But what they don't do is they do not tie it back, right? They don't tie it back to their thesis statement or create some cohesive argument. So they don't get only 1 point for that. The Crown was putting a massive tax on the smallest things. 0 points, right? There's no evidence there. Which Crown? What tax? What things? Nothing specific in there. They do not get that point. During the 1754s to 1776, America had been left on its own to self-govern themselves and was given an opportunity to establish its own government. This one's a little bit trickier, and you need to know some history. Some 54 to 76, it's actually out of time frame. So this is factually incorrect. Now, what they're talking about is salutary neglect. And had they talked about it from earlier, then that would have been okay. But it's not, right? It's out of time frame, so it's not a good argument for this. Okay, example 4. The Stamp Act was the direct tax on the colonists that They really noticed. The colonists responded to this with the proclamation of no taxation without representation, the argument that they could not be taxed if they weren't represented in Parliament. This is actually the two-pointer right here, right? We have evidence, the Stamp Act, but we also have them, literally the argument that could not be taxed if they weren't represented in Parliament. They have them supporting their own argument there, all right? And they're very clear on that. Lastly, example 5, it does address the British Tea Party, but it does not actually support an argument in it, so that would have been 1 point. Hopefully you got them all right. All right, let's look at analysis and reasoning. And I do want to look very carefully at the new rubric particularly. So if we look at analysis and reasoning, one, you need to point out that you have to get analysis in order to get complexity, right? You have to get the continuity and change causation portion in order to get that complexity point on there. So if you don't get it, then you don't get the complexity point. But getting the complexity point is suddenly much more easier, right? And let's get to that in a second. But first, with analysis, make sure you're actually answering the question. When looking at the prompt, try to identify which historical reasoning skill it's looking for. If you're actually answering the question, it should be interwoven into your essay at that point. And I'm just going to touch on this 1 point. We can go back and look at some of the different ways you can do this. But right here, explaining how multiple pieces of evidence, specific and relevant evidence, at least 4, support a nuanced or complex argument that responds to the prompt. And then we followed up with using evidence effectively to demonstrate a sophisticated understanding of different perspectives relevant to the prompt. If we do these 2 things, or if you follow the format or the template I gave you in the previous slide, you will actually inevitably just be doing these 2 things on your own, right? They'll be interwoven already, and so you will have already earned the complexity point. So it makes it really easy to get a 6 on the essay. As long as you follow the formula, you'll get yourself a 6 on the essay. Let's look at some examples of analysis here. We'll see if we have time for them all. What I want you to do is go ahead and pause the screen, read over the prompt again, figure out if they earn the point or not, and then unpause. Okay, so go ahead and pause it now. All right, you've looked at them now. Let's look at the examples and see if they've earned the analysis point. Did they actually apply historical reasoning to it? All right, so example number 1 does not get the point. The response attempts to demonstrate causation or change over time, but it lacks specifics to structure an argument that addresses the prompt. Frankly, it's just poorly written overall, right? All right, example number 2. It is factually wrong. It does not get the point, and it disagrees with the prompt, right? If you get a prompt that is implying, hey, how much of this actually happened? And you come back and say, well, it didn't happen, right? That is actually not a good response to the prompt. Sometimes you'll be able to do it, but most often than not, don't disagree with the prompt. Don't argue with the question, right? Try to answer the question the best you can. And every now and then they will throw you for a loop, but most of the time, just don't argue with it. Example 3 does get the point, right? It has multiple historical thinking skills. It identifies the reasons why resistance to the Navigation Act was limited in comparison to later taxes, such as the Stamp Act, and this corroborates the original argument for showing similarities and differences over time. All right. Now, all that's left for you is practice, 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 right? Go into the progress checks on AP Classroom and practice this as much as you can. Get some of this down. All right.